Hello, my name is Shannon Betzold, and I am giving my presentation on special needs groups and disasters. Through our education this semester, we have learned the importance of using universal language. In the effort to create terminology that remains constant throughout the field of emergency management, whether local, federal, or even private sector, the National Response Framework established a definition that would best serve the purposes of this planning. This definition is based on function instead of a label or diagnosis, as it allows for the generalization of several different groups instead of the specifics of just one diagnosis. This method allows for people to receive the attention that they deserve, especially in the scary situation that can be a disaster event. The definition identifies a special needs individual or group as those citizens that require needs that exceed the typical needs of the general population. It is also important to note that these needs can occur before, during, and after the events. While they can include the elderly, disabled, or children, these labels are too specific and complicate the planning process by overwhelming it with requirements. The National Response Framework definition, however, puts the focus more on the function. An individual's mobility, their communication methods, and even socioeconomic status can all play a role in determining a special need group and what functional needs they require. For instance, one of the most common groups that come to mind when mentioning those with special needs is the community that are commonly labeled with disabilities. With 42.5 million non-institutionalized civilians living with some sort of disability, this group does not discriminate. It affects all ages, races, and socioeconomic statuses. They can have clearly identifiable needs such as a wheelchair or other medical equipment, but they can also have invisible conditions, such as being neuroatypical. Their different abilities create obstacles the average person does not need to consider. For example, how does one quickly evacuate a location when wheelchair accessibility is either unavailable or very limited? Or will a service animal be allowed to stay with its owner in the shelter? And what medical equipment will be needed to continue living as independently as possible during or after a disaster event? Other questions have to deal with preparations made prior to the disaster event. People with disabilities struggle to make a comparable income to citizens without disabilities. The median income a person with disabilities earns is about $40,000, almost $41,000 per year. Meanwhile, a person with disabilities earns just a fraction of that, with a median income of $28,000 per year. This leads to how income is a factor when identifying special needs groups. With low or no income, preparing for a disaster often takes the back seat. People are busy prioritizing utility bills, food sources, or just prescription medicine costs, and don't have the extra funds to buy excess materials for a disaster kit that may or may not be needed for some random disaster. Also, considering their utility costs can play a factor during such events as a snowstorm or a heat wave. To keep energy costs low, those low-income citizens may limit the use or just flat out not own an air conditioning or heating unit. Some may argue that people with low socioeconomic status are eligible for government assistance and should be able to prioritize their bills appropriately. However, it is not always that simple. Often, during and after a disaster, the bureaucratic response is delayed, or at least sometimes non-existent. Therefore, the citizens depending on non-disaster related assistance like medical care or food assistance and so on are left waiting for extended period of time without funds to provide for their basic needs. It is also imperative to note the locations of those low income level live. As developers build neighborhoods, it is often in such areas that are more prone to disasters, such as flooding, that cheaper and more affordable housing is available. Therefore, those with low socioeconomic statuses are more likely to fall victim to the disaster. This location will also play an important factor in things like transportation. And in an urban area where public transit is popular and readily available, not as many citizens use vehicles, and therefore vehicles are not a special need. But in rural areas, one depends on vehicles for transportation. Evacuation can be difficult and possibly impossible for lower income people because they may not have a car, or maybe it broke down and they haven't been able to pay for the mechanic, or even just filling up with gas. It becomes very limited and difficult. Alerts and evacuation notices can also prove difficult for those with communication limitations. This is an important instance of when function beats label, as communication barriers do not just exist for those with disabilities. 1 in 5 civilians in the United States speaks a language other than just English. So when the local news stations are reporting the weather, for example, in English, a very large portion of the population may not understand the warnings. Using a translator or a translation device are sometimes needed to express the message. Education can also play a role in communication, as 1 in 5 US adults are considered to have low literacy skills, meaning they struggle with things such as just reading and writing. Reading notices or filling out legal documentation, like during the recovery period, becomes extra challenging for these individuals. When considering communication planning, it is important to include several methods to reach as many individuals as possible. The emergency alert system has developed methods in which they send out alerts via radio, television, broadcast. Note this also helps with low-income families who may not own 1 or more of these devices. During these alerts, the emergency alert system uses closed captionings for those with hearing difficulties and oral tones to alert those with eyesight challenges. Emergency responders have also incorporated devices such as a teletypewriter for 911 calls for the deaf or speech impaired. As mentioned earlier, it is important to realize that individuals in special needs groups often have obstacles when planning and prepping for a disaster. While an average citizen prepares a kit with items such as flashlights, first aid, some clothes and food and water, special needs groups must take extra considerations. In the case of evacuation, how will they access transportation? Once evacuated, where can they receive their medical care, like dialysis or chemo? Will shelters accommodate for their service animals? The disaster kits will also need specific items like a surplus of medications. Low-income families can have difficulties with this as well. Any and all legal paperwork, such as do not resuscitate papers, their official diagnosis, school IEPs for children with disabilities, and so on. If they are not able to evacuate, they must consider how to power medical equipment. And if they do evacuate, what equipment will they be able to bring? It will most likely not be their standard equipment, so they'll need backups that are transportable and lightweight. While the people with special needs are busy trying to figure out how to maintain an individual life, the government must take steps to protect its citizens. In a review after Hurricane Katrina, it was found that many emergency plans did not have the appropriate considerations, if any, for the special needs population. It is now stressed that the government must practice an inclusive approach when planning. Involve stakeholders from, but not limited to, voluntary organizations, hospitals, nursing homes, cultural groups, rehabilitation centers, and homeless shelters. Certain laws and policies have been developed over the decades, such as the American Disabilities Act and the Rehabilitation Act, that help protect special needs populations. However, it is up to the government to hold itself and others accountable when those policies or laws are violated. One of the best methods to avoid violating policies is to appropriately plan and then continue to adapt and train staff and responders. This planning and training saves lives and aids in a quick recovery and return to normalcy for the community. While the amount of information concerning disasters in the special needs populations can appear and is at times overwhelming, resources have been created to help create a smooth and simple planning process. There's a wealth of knowledge thanks to just simple, quick Google searches. However, a few reliable sources are included here, such as the American Red Cross, the Humane Society, the Center of Disease Control and Prevention, and the website ready.gov, which is an organized site dedicated to helping everyone, from the average citizen to caregivers to those with disabilities, even your pets. Thank you so much for listening to my presentation. I hope it provided just a little bit of extra information for you. Have a great day.